Well, friends in the spirit, grace to you, peace, blessings abound in being together in fellowship. I feel a bit of a homecoming and happiness, as Horst was saying, a joy to be with you again. To get into this topic of how do we operationalize grace in ourselves and in our lives, we're going to begin with a thought experiment with a practice that comes from Dr. Kristen Neff. So on your blue papers, I invite you to write some things. First, I invite you to think about someone who's struggling. Think about a time, for example, when a close friend feels really bad about him or herself. They're struggling in some way, okay? The question I'd like you to answer, just in words or sentences on one side of your paper, is how would you respond to your friend in this situation, especially when you're at your best? Maybe write down what you typically might do, what you might say, or the tone that you might talk to them with. A friend who's struggling in some way. How would you respond to them? Write down words, phrases, a thing you might do. After you've written down just a couple ideas, I invite you now to think about a time when you feel bad about yourself or you are struggling. This could be like a season or just like in the moment, in the day. How do you typically respond to yourself in those situations? Write down what you typically do, what you say, or note the tone in which you talk to yourself on the other side. And now my third question is, when you look at side 1 and side 2, do you notice a difference? Maybe they're exactly the same, and then you can just like zone out for the rest of this message. But if there's any difference, right? I wonder if you could ask yourself why. And what factors or fears might come into play that lead you to treat yourself and others differently? Put those aside for now. Compassion. Compassion arises when we see another touched by suffering and we are moved to take action. Self-compassion happens when we are touched by suffering ourselves. And as Kristen Neff puts it, we find a way to hold our own pain in love. Another word I would use for this holding is to hold ourselves with grace. Grace, this pure gift of love or presence, acceptance or care without any strings attached. Grace, like compassion, is something often easy to give to others, but more difficult to direct back at ourselves. Because accepting ourselves as we are, all of who we are, is perhaps the most challenging part of a life's journey. And I would argue, no matter our age, our perceived maturity, each of us have things in us, deep and persistent things, real things that we would rather not accept, befriend, or even acknowledge in ourselves. We would rather bypass those roads altogether than go down them. No matter how our outlook might be on others, we can remain to our inmost self something of an anti-hero. As Taylor Swift sings in a song by the same name, she says, I stare directly in the sun, but never in the mirror. But what if befriending that which we don't want to acknowledge in ourselves is the very recipe for befriending all others with unconditional care? What if holding ultimate grace with ourselves is the key to extending that same grace to our neighbors, our colleagues, and our communities? What if what we think is but scratchy straw in us to be discarded or used as livestock bedding is in fact the gold that would pave the way to our own liberation? My professor of meditation, Dale Asriel, shared this story in the early days of learning this past semester. It comes from the Tibetan tradition. And it's the story about a cave-dwelling yogi named Milarepa. This one is told in the words of R. Glaser. Glaser writes this: one day, Milarepa left his cave to go gather firewood, and when he returned, he found that his cave was filled and had been taken over by demons. There were demons everywhere. His first thought about seeing them is like, I have to get rid of them. So he lunges forward and he chases them, trying to forcefully get them out of his cave. But the demons are completely unfazed. In fact, the more he chases them, the more comfortable and settled in they seem to get. Realizing this, that his efforts to run them out have failed miserably, Milarepa opts for a new approach and decides to teach them the Dharma. If chasing them out won't work, then maybe hearing the teachings will change their minds and get them to go. So he takes his seat and begins teaching about existence and non-existence, compassion and kindness, the nature of impermanence. After a while, he looks around and he realizes all the demons are still there. They simply stare at him with their huge bulging eyes. Not a single one is leaving. At this point, Milarepa lets out a deep breath of surrender, knowing now that these demons will not be manipulated into leaving, and that maybe they have something to teach him. So he looks deeply into the eyes of each demon and bows, saying, it looks like we're going to be here together. I open myself to whatever you have to teach me. And in that moment, all the demons but one disappear. One huge and especially fierce demon with flaring nostrils and dripping fangs is still there. So Milarepa lets go even further. Stepping over to the largest demon, he offers himself completely, holding nothing back. Eat me if you wish. He places his head in the demon's mouth. And at that moment, the largest demon bows low and dissolves into space. What do you think the demons stand for? What do you think the last demon stood for? One possibility my professor posited was that perhaps this is what Milarepa had not yet befriended in himself, that final demon, so to say. And so this story challenges us. What in yourself have you not befriended? What are the limits of grace with yourself? Tara Brach is a meditation teacher, psychologist, and an author, and she speaks about what she calls radical acceptance as one possible answer. Radical acceptance to Brach is defined as clearly recognizing what is happening within ourselves and regarding what we see with an open, kind, and loving heart. There are two wings, so to say. On the one wing is the clear seeing of all that is happening in us mindfully, not avoiding or denying an emotion, albeit strong like fear or anger, just knowing what it is when it's there. And that second wing is accepting whatever came up with kindness and curiosity, compassion. Holding what arises in us with the compassion and tenderness of a mother with their newborn, she says. For, Bratch says, if we are holding back from any part of our experience, if our heart shuts out any part of who we are and what we feel, we are fueling the fears and feelings of separation that sustain what she calls the trance of unworthiness. The trance of unworthiness. Grace, as I have come to understand it, means acceptance of your fundamental enoughness. All of you. The parts that are whole, the parts that are broken, whether you're acting as sinner or saint or both, at the beginning or at the end of the day, whether you accomplish one productive thing or not, you are enough because you exist. Grace. One pastor I know defined God's grace like that of a snow globe. You know, you just like you're in it and you can't escape it. It's all around you. It can be shaken, but you can't get loose of it. The loving presence of the divine is a given. But that's all fine and great to say about something like a God concept, but do we believe it and feel the same notions towards ourselves? That perhaps is what makes all the difference, or at least a starting difference. Do we extend that same concept of grace to ourselves? Jack Kornfield, I've been reading this book for my classes this week or this semester. In his book, A Path with Heart, he tells a story about a professor of psychology who came to meditation seeking peace and understanding. His story goes like this. He says she was educated in psychological theory, had studied Eastern philosophy, and wanted to delve into the workings of the mind and understand the play of consciousness, but her body would not cooperate. She had had a lifelong struggle with a degenerative disease that caused periods of great pain and weakness in her body. In the back of her mind, she had hoped the meditation would ease the pain so that she could then go on to discover the deeper aspects of Buddhist psychology. Yet each time she meditated, aches and pains would fill her sitting and walking periods. She couldn't get over her pain. And after several retreats, as her frustration grew, her pain got worse. She wanted experiences, not the same old chronic pain. She was regularly asked what her relationship was to the pain. "Oh, I'm just being aware of it," she would claim, still secretly hoping it would go away. One day, after hours of frustrated sitting with the pain, she let go of her resistance, and with a truly open attention, she saw it differently. She realized that she had spent her entire life trying to get outside her body completely. She hated her pain and she hated her body, and meditation was one more means she hoped to use to get out of herself. How deeply she wept when she finally saw this. How little love she had shown her own body. This was the turning point in her spiritual practice. She decided that if the work given to her was to sit with the body in pain, she would bring to it all the tenderness and mercy she could. As she honored her body and sat with its pain, her body began to soften. But more than that, her whole life began to change. A great love and compassion grew in her eyes, and she herself became a teacher of the spiritual values she had once sought. The poet Rumi put it this way: the spirit and the body carry different loads and require different attentions. Too often we put saddlebags on Jesus and let the donkey run loose in the pasture. In that same chapter, Kornfield shares that, like the maiden in the fairy tale Rumpelstiltskin, who is locked away in a room full of straw, we often do not realize, he says, that the straw all around us is gold in disguise. And that the very basic principle of spiritual life is that our problems become the very places we discover wisdom and love. Our problems become the very places we discover wisdom and love. But to embrace all that is in you with radical acceptance and grace, some might raise issues. Tara Brach addresses those. She says to have unconditional positive regard for self and all that you are and all that you feel is not the same as resignation. Like, this is just the way I am, take it or leave it. Rather, unconditional regard is about seeing yourself clearly and with care, which almost always moves towards positive change. 2, Tara Brach will point out that radical acceptance is not self-indulgence, saying like, I have this lust or this craving and therefore I must give into it. Radical self-acceptance doesn't allow you to just always sit on the couch watching Netflix without end and never leave, because ultimately that is not what is most compassionate towards self in the long run. Finally, radical acceptance does not mean passivity. Radical acceptance acknowledges our own experience in this moment as the first step towards wise action. As Carl Rogers put it, the curious paradox is that when I accept myself as I am, then I can change. When I accept myself as I am, then I can change. So for Kristen Neff, self-compassion, or as I call it, grace, is operationalized in these ways. Again, first, it's that clear seeing, that mindfulness of what is, making space for all of you, for all the feelings, all the hurts. And if it is a moment where the emotion is hard, you feel slighted or angry or sad, to just pause and say, this is a moment of suffering. The second wing would be to greet whatever comes up in us day by day with kindness and tenderness and care, to talk to yourself like you would a friend. And whatever comes up in you day by day, moment by moment, to acknowledge, to learn from, to cradle even. Some would say to even sit down and have tea with your anger, for it might be your teacher. And finally, a third thing that Kristen Neff would add is that we remember then in all of this, where we clearly see what's happening, we hold it with compassion, then we remember our common humanity. We remember common humanity, lest you fall into self-pity, that you might call to mind that you're probably not alone in whatever you're feeling or experiencing. To remember that to have pain is not abnormal or unusual, that is a part of life. Nothing is wrong. Others have and are suffering as you are, most likely in this moment somewhere in the world. Those radical wings, right? To accept, to know what's happening, to accept it, and realize you're not alone. What if that's grace operationalized? Self-compassion as a practice. Befriending that which we don't want to acknowledge in ourselves in order to befriend others with unconditional care. Holding ultimate grace with ourselves that we might extend that same grace to our neighbors and our colleagues. And then having the courage to stick our heads into the mouths of our own demons, taking the straw around us and finding in it gold. I wonder at what transformation, at what difference that would make in our lives, in our communities, in our worlds. Amen. We sing a second